He returned 8 times. Every sunset brought him back to the same runway, the same commanders, the same impossible choice between honor and survival. Each time, the officers told him tomorrow would be different. Each time, Kazuo Odachi climbed into the cockpit of his Mitsubishi A6M Zero, felt the 1,100-pound bomb drag against the fuselage, and flew toward American warships he could not find, would not find, or chose not to find. The line between mission failure and quiet refusal dissolves at 20,000 feet when a 17-year-old pilot decides whether to die for an empire already lost. Before we go deeper into how this decision changed the Pacific War forever, make sure to subscribe for more history that actually happened. By August 1944, Japan's defeat was not a question, but a timetable. American forces had shattered the combined fleet at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The Philippines were falling. Saipan's collapse had brought 29 superfortresses within striking range of the home islands. In the aftermath of the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, where Japanese naval aviation lost over 600 aircraft and 3 fleet carriers in a single day, the Imperial Japanese Navy faced a mathematical certainty: it could not replace pilots faster than America could produce them. The technological gap had widened into a chasm, where Japan fielded aging A6M Zeros with fabric-covered control surfaces and no armor plating. The United States Navy launched Grumman F-6F Hellcats with self-sealing fuel tanks, hydraulic systems, and speed advantages that turned dogfights into executions. The Zero, which had ruled the Pacific skies in 1942, now flew as a relic against an enemy that outproduced, outtrained, and outsurvived it at every turn. This reality birthed a weapon born of desperation disguised as philosophy. In October 1944, Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi stood before assembled pilots at Mabalacat Airfield in the Philippines and proposed what Japan's leadership would frame as the ultimate expression of Bushido spirit, the Tokubetsu Keigekitai, the Special Attack Units. History would call them Kamikaze after the divine wind that scattered Mongol invasion fleets in the 13th century. Onishi's logic possessed a brutal arithmetic. Japan could no longer win through conventional combat, but suicide attacks required neither advanced training nor superior equipment. A novice pilot willing to die could fly an obsolete aircraft loaded with explosives into an enemy warship with far greater accuracy than he could ever achieve dropping a bomb. One plane, one pilot, one ship. The mathematics of annihilation reduced to its simplest form. The proposal met with silence. When Onishi finished speaking and asked for volunteers, not a single hand rose. The mythology of eager kamikaze pilots volunteering en masse dissolves. Upon contact with historical record, these were not fanatics rushing toward death, but young men, many of them university students conscripted from Japan's finest institutions, who understood exactly what was being asked. Only after officers began to harangue the assembled pilots, invoking duty to the emperor and shame before their families, did hands begin to rise. The first volunteers emerged not from enthusiasm, but from social coercion, so intense that refusal became psychologically impossible. They were given slips of white paper with 3 options: to volunteer willingly, to volunteer, or to decline. In practice, the third option existed only on paper. To refuse meant branding your family with permanent dishonor, condemning parents and siblings to social ostracism in a culture where collective shame outweighed individual survival. Kazuo Odachi was 17 years old when he received his assignment to the Yokorin, the elite naval aviation program that transformed teenage boys into combat pilots. He had grown up near an air base, fascinated by the aircraft that roared overhead, and when war erupted, he had dreamed of flying. That dream now carried the weight of inevitability. The Yokorin trained its cadets differently from standard pilot programs. They were celebrated as cherry blossoms, a flower prized in Japanese culture for its brief, vivid beauty. Even the buttons on their uniforms bore the cherry blossom emblem, a constant reminder that their lives would bloom brilliantly and die quickly. Instructors made certain every cadet understood they were not being trained to return. Victory through survival was never the objective. Victory through death became the doctrine. The training bordered on systematic brutalization. Daily corporal punishment served not merely as discipline, but as psychological conditioning, an attempt to strip away the human instinct for self-preservation. Instructors beat cadets for minor infractions, for perceived weakness, for any sign that might suggest hesitation when the moment came to die. One pilot later described the regime as torturous, designed to dehumanize them so thoroughly that climbing into a bomb-laden aircraft would feel like relief. The logic held that if they could endure daily suffering, death would arrive as release rather than horror. Yet this training could not eliminate the fundamental human drive to live. It could only bury it beneath layers of indoctrination, shame, and exhausted resignation. Odachi arrived in Japanese-occupied Taiwan in August 1944 as the war entered its terminal phase. American forces had achieved complete air superiority over the Pacific. Japanese factories could no longer produce aircraft fast enough to replace losses. Fuel shortages grounded squadrons across the empire. Experienced pilots who had survived the early war years were dead, and their replacements received perhaps 30 hours of flight training before being thrown into combat against American aviators with hundreds of hours in the cockpit. The Yokoren pilots represented Japan's attempt to offset numerical and technological inferiority with ideological fervor to transform young men into guided missiles before such weapons existed. But ideology cannot override mechanical failure, weather, or the simple fact that even the most dedicated pilot cannot hit a target he cannot find. The doctrine of kamikaze attacks possessed certain tactical advantages that Japanese commanders found compelling. Unlike conventional bombing runs that required pilots to survive anti-aircraft fire, line up a target at altitude, release ordnance, and escape, suicide attacks eliminated every variable except impact. A kamikaze pilot needed only to keep his aircraft flying until it struck steel. Training requirements plummeted. Navigation skills mattered only until the pilot spotted the enemy fleet. Aerial combat maneuvers became irrelevant because survival was not the goal. The weapons themselves required minimal sophistication. Engineers stripped Zeros of unnecessary equipment, removed armor plating that might save the pilot, and bolted bombs directly to the fuselage. An A6M Zero modified for kamikaze duty typically carried an 250-kilogram bomb under the centerline, though some missions employed 500-kilogram ordnance. The weight transformed the aircraft from a nimble fighter into a flying bomb with just enough lift to reach its target. On October 25, 1944, the first organized kamikaze mission launched from a Balakat airfield. The results stunned both sides. 5 Zeros loaded with bombs descended on an American escort carrier group off the Philippines. 2 were shot down. 2 missed their targets. The 5th, piloted by a volunteer who may or may not have intended to die that morning, struck the USS St. Lo directly through the flight deck. The bomb penetrated into the hangar, where aircraft were being fueled and armed. The resulting explosion reached the ship's magazine. Within 30 minutes, the St. Lo sank. One obsolete fighter flown by a barely trained pilot had accomplished what conventional attacks had failed to achieve throughout the Pacific War. It had sunk an American aircraft carrier. The strategic implications cascaded through both command structures. For Japan, the kamikaze offered hope where none had existed. If suicide attacks could sink carriers, perhaps they could make the cost of invading Japan so catastrophic that the United States would accept a negotiated peace. For American commanders, the threat required immediate tactical revolution. Admiral William Halsey, who had led carrier task forces since Midway, confessed that the kamikaze were the only Japanese weapon he truly feared. Unlike conventional attacks that could be defeated through superior technology and training, suicide attacks exploited a fundamental asymmetry. The Americans had to defend perfectly every time, while the kamikaze needed to succeed only once. But the mythology of kamikaze effectiveness diverges sharply from reality. Of the approximately 3,860 kamikaze pilots who flew missions between October 1944 and August 1945, Only about 700 achieved hits on Allied vessels. The success rate hovered around 19%. The remaining 81% died without reaching their targets, shot down by fighter patrols or anti-aircraft fire, or their missions were aborted due to weather, mechanical failure, or an inability to locate the enemy. This figure does not account for pilots who returned to base claiming to have found no suitable targets. Approximately 1/4 to 1/3 of kamikaze sorties failed to reach intended targets. Some aircraft crashed in the sea due to pilot inexperience. Some were intercepted by American fighter patrols stationed specifically to prevent kamikaze attacks. And some pilots simply turned around. Kazuo Odachi flew his first kamikaze mission on April 4, 1945. His Zero had been loaded with an 1,100-pound bomb that dragged so heavily on the airframe that the aircraft could barely maintain altitude. Normal Zeros were nimble, capable of outturning any American fighter at low speeds. With a bomb nearly as heavy as the pilot and fuel combined, the Zero became sluggish, incapable of evasive maneuvers, a target painted in the sky. Odachi's orders were explicit. Locate the American fleet reported near Okinawa, select a carrier if possible, and dive into the deck at the point between the bridge and the smokestack. Aim for the deck elevators on aircraft carriers because penetrating to the hangar deck would cause maximum destruction. Keep eyes open until impact to ensure accurate strike. In the final seconds, radio the word Hisatsu, certain kill, so that observers could record the mission as successful. He found no targets that day. Whether this represented genuine failure to locate American ships or a choice he made above the clouds is a question history cannot definitively answer. When American fighters appeared on the horizon, Odachi jettisoned his bomb into the ocean and turned for home. The bomb, which he was meant to deliver by dying, fell uselessly into the Pacific. He landed at his base in Taiwan, reported mechanical trouble and inability to locate targets, and waited to be executed or reassigned. He was simply told to prepare for another mission. The Caton Doctrine included provisions for pilots who returned without completing their mission. Official policy stated that if pilots encountered mechanical problems, adverse weather, or genuinely could not locate enemy vessels, they were permitted to return and would fly again the following day or when conditions improved. This policy existed partially for practical reasons. Crashes due to mechanical failure wasted aircraft and pilots without damaging the enemy, and partially because Japanese commanders understood that social pressure and group psychology would push pilots back into the cockpit. A pilot who returned once would face the questioning stares of his squadron mates. A pilot who returned twice would endure whispered conversations about his courage. The mechanism of shame required no formal punishment because the punishment was omnipresent. Yet the line between legitimate mission abort and covert refusal remained deliberately ambiguous. In the chaos of late-war operations with communication breakdowns and scattered forces, verifying whether a pilot truly encountered insurmountable obstacles was nearly impossible. American carrier groups moved constantly to avoid air attack. Weather over the Pacific changed hourly. A pilot who claimed he searched for 3 hours without finding targets could be telling objective truth, or he could have flown in the wrong direction deliberately. The system depended on trust that had been eroded by desperation. Some returning pilots were beaten by ground crews. Some faced formal questioning by military police. Some were reassigned to new squadrons where they remained under suspicion. And some were shot. Francis Pike's exhaustive study of the kamikaze campaign includes a single chilling line. On one occasion, a kamikaze pilot who returned to base 9 times was shot and executed. The claim appears without citation, without names, without corroboration. It exists as a ghost in the historical record, repeated across sources, but never substantiated. Whether this execution actually occurred or represents an apocryphal warning story designed to keep pilots compliant cannot be determined with certainty. What can be confirmed is that Japanese military police did execute soldiers for perceived cowardice throughout the war, particularly as defeat loomed and discipline began fragmenting. The threat of execution may have been more powerful than the act itself. Every pilot who contemplated turning back had to consider whether he would be the one chosen as an example. Odachi returned 7 more times. His second mission ended when his squadron failed to locate targets due to cloud cover. The third ended in mechanical failure. The fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, and eighth missions are recorded in his memoir with sparse detail. He flew. He searched. He did not die. Each return brought him before commanders who grew increasingly skeptical. After the fourth return, officers began tracking his flight paths more carefully. After the sixth, rumors circulated that he was deliberately avoiding contact. But Japan was losing the war so rapidly that even suspected cowards became valuable. Experienced pilots, even those who refused to die, could train the next wave of kamikaze. They could lead formations. They could provide some defense against America. Other pilots faced different outcomes. Take Hiko Aina, a 20-year-old economics student from Waseda University, was drafted into the Naval Kamikaze program in April 1945. His training lasted weeks rather than months. He was assigned to pilot a crew of 3 aboard a plane carrying an 800-kilogram bomb with fuel sufficient only for a one-way flight. On April 28, 1945, his aircraft failed to get airborne during takeoff. Mechanical failure. 2 weeks later, engine trouble forced an emergency landing while still carrying the bomb. 11 days after that, his plane crashed into the sea during a third attempt. Aina and his 2 crew members survived and swam to nearby Kurashima Island, where they remained for 2.5 months until a Japanese submarine retrieved them. The war ended before they could be sent on a 4th mission. Aina later acknowledged that he had volunteered because refusing would have branded him a coward, and because he believed he would die in the war regardless. Better to die with purpose than in anonymous combat. Yet 3 mechanical failures saved his life, and he never had to choose whether to complete the final dive. The psychological architecture of the kamikaze system relied on making individual choice impossible. Pilots were assigned to missions in groups, with launch ceremonies involving reading of death poems, ritual drinking of sake, and exchanges of personal effects that would be sent to families after confirmation of death. These ceremonies served multiple functions. They reinforced that the mission was inevitable. They created peer pressure through public commitment. They transformed private doubt into collective resolve through shared ritual. A pilot who expressed reluctance at a ceremony would not merely be questioned by commanders, but would betray the squadron mates who had already accepted death. The ceremony made backing out a social death before physical death, and in Japanese military culture, social death was often considered worse. But not all pilots accepted this framework. Some kamikaze deliberately crashed into the ocean rather than American ships. Some angled their aircraft to miss at the last second. Some developed elaborate excuses for why they could not complete missions. And some, like Odachi, simply returned repeatedly until the war ended. These acts of quiet resistance rarely entered official records. A pilot who crashed into the sea without witnesses could claim anti-aircraft fire damage. A pilot who missed his target could claim last-second mechanical failure. The chaos of kamikaze operations, with hundreds of aircraft launching in mass attacks, made precise verification impossible. American ships shot down Japanese aircraft in such numbers that survivors were statistical anomalies. The American response to kamikaze attacks evolved rapidly through late 1944 and 1945. Initially, carrier groups depended on combat air patrols stationed above the fleet to intercept incoming aircraft. This proved insufficient because kamikaze would hide in clouds, approach at wave-top altitude, or follow American planes back to their carriers. Vice Admiral John McCain developed the Big Blue Blanket defense system that positioned destroyer picket ships 60 miles from the carrier groups. These destroyers served as radar early warning posts and fighter control stations. American pilots would execute sharp turns around these radio buoys that allowed combat air patrol to identify Japanese aircraft attempting to follow them. Any aircraft that failed to execute the correct return procedure was immediately engaged as hostile. The system significantly reduced successful kamikaze attacks, though it could not eliminate them entirely. Anti-aircraft defenses also improved dramatically. The introduction of proximity-fused shells transformed naval gunnery. These shells contained miniature radar systems that detonated the warhead when it passed near an aircraft, creating a lethal fragmentation cloud. Proximity fuses increased anti-aircraft effectiveness by 700% compared to traditional time-delayed fuses. Rapid-fire 40mm Bofors cannons and 20mm Oerlikon guns provided layers of defensive fire that Kamikaze had to penetrate. Even with these improvements, approximately 13% of Kamikaze that reached visual range of American ships successfully struck their targets. 1 in 8. The odds favored the defenders, but not overwhelmingly. By June 1945, Japan's kamikaze capability was deteriorating. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft. Experienced pilots who could lead formations were dead or reassigned to defense of the home islands. Aircraft production could not keep pace with losses. Odachi, stationed in Taiwan, watched American flying boats land brazenly in nearby bays to retrieve downed bomber crews. Japanese forces lacked the fuel to intercept them. The absolute air superiority the United States had achieved made kamikaze missions increasingly suicidal without even the slim hope of reaching a target. Pilots took off knowing they would likely be shot down before ever seeing an enemy ship. On August 15, 1945, Odachi was preparing for his 9th mission. His Zero sat on the runway, bomb attached, fuel loaded. The pre-flight ceremony had concluded. He was walking toward the aircraft when a member of the ground crew ran onto the runway, shouting and waving his arms. The mission was canceled. Minutes later, the reason became clear. Emperor Hirohito had announced Japan's surrender. The war was over. Odachi climbed out of his flight suit and went home. On the train journey through the bombed remains of Hiroshima, he comprehended for the first time the scale of Japan's defeat. The city had been erased. Buildings that had stood for centuries were shadows burned into concrete. Survivors wandered with injuries that medicine could not treat. The empire that had demanded he die to defend it no longer existed. When he reached his family home in Tokyo, he took the ceremonial short sword that marked his status as a kamikaze pilot and threw it into the hearthfire. The blade melted into an unrecognizable lump of steel. For the next 70 years, Odachi told almost no one about his wartime service. He became a police officer in Tokyo, married, raised a family. His wife knew only that he had served as a naval pilot. The specifics remained locked away because explaining felt impossible. How could he convey the experience of being 17 years old, ordered to die for a lost cause, and choosing to live? How could he articulate the guilt of surviving when thousands of fellow pilots had flown into American ships and vaporized? The post-war narrative in Japan treated kamikaze with ambivalence. Some saw them as martyrs who had sacrificed everything for a doomed nation. Others viewed them as victims of militaristic fanaticism, young men who died unnecessarily for leaders who knew the war was lost. Neither framework left space for pilots who had been ordered to die. Other surviving kamikaze faced similar struggles with silence. Takehiko Aina returned to complete his economics degree at Waseda University and spent the rest of his life as a businessman, never speaking publicly about his 3 failed missions until decades later. Isao Horiyama, who had volunteered eagerly for the special attack units, believing death for the emperor was the highest honor, spent his post-war life wrestling with the reality that his willingness to die had been manipulated by commanders who had no intention of dying themselves. Lieutenant General Kyoji Tominaga, who stood on runways waving his sword and shouting to pilots that he would follow them in death, never flew a single mission. He was captured by Soviet forces in Manchuria after the surrender and spent years in a prisoner of war camp before being repatriated. He lived to age 70. This pattern repeated throughout Japan's military hierarchy. The officers who conceived, organized, and celebrated the kamikaze program almost universally survived the war. They had convinced thousands of young men to die based on the promise that their sacrifice would save the nation, that the Americans would recoil, at Japanese resolve and agreed to negotiate. The promise was a lie. Every kamikaze death after the Battle of Leyte Gulf was strategically meaningless. Japan lost the war at precisely the same pace it would have lost without suicide attacks, only with several thousand additional young men dead for no military purpose. The kamikaze sank approximately 50 Allied vessels and damaged 366 others, a figure that sounds devastating until placed against American production capacity. The United States built over 140 aircraft carriers during World War II, along with thousands of destroyers, cruisers, transports, and support vessels. Sinking 50 ships barely registered as an inconvenience. The true cost of the kamikaze program was measured not in ships sunk, but in lives conscripted into death. Approximately 3,860 kamikaze pilots died in organized attacks. An additional unknown number died in similar suicide missions involving midget submarines, explosive boats, and human torpedoes. These were not warriors dying in combat. They were teenagers and university students placed in aircraft with just enough fuel to reach the enemy and ordered to crash. Many were coerced through mechanisms of shame and social pressure, so intense that refusal would have destroyed their families. Some genuinely believed in the cause. Some went because they saw no alternative, and some, like Odachi, found ways to resist without openly refusing. But what separated pilots who returned from those who completed their final dives? The question has no simple answer because the factors varied with each individual. Some, like Odachi, encountered genuine mechanical problems or weather conditions that made missions impossible to complete. He jettisoned his bomb when American fighters appeared because to continue meant dying without striking a target. That decision might represent sound tactical judgment or covert refusal, and 70 years later the distinction has dissolved. Other pilots manufactured excuses. Engine trouble could be real or imagined. Inability to find the enemy could reflect navigation errors or deliberate wrong turns. The pressure to complete the mission was immense, but the mechanisms of verification were weak enough that determined pilots could exploit them. The psychological weight of returning fell heaviest on pilots who came back repeatedly. A first return could be explained. A second raised questions. A third brought suspicion. By the fourth or fifth, a pilot faced assumptions of cowardice regardless of legitimate reasons. Odachi's 8 returns marked him as suspect among both superiors and peers, yet he was never formally punished because Japan desperately needed even reluctant pilots. The executions that did occur, and historical documentation of these remains fragmentary, seem to serve as symbolic warnings rather than systematic punishment. If Japan had executed every pilot who returned without completing his mission, the kamikaze program would have collapsed from lack of personnel. The ambiguity extended into the post-war period. Surviving kamikaze pilots lived with questions about why they lived when thousands died. Some attributed survival to providence or mechanical luck. Others acknowledged that they had made choices, subtle or overt, that preserved their lives. The distinction between honorable survival and cowardly refusal became a personal moral calculation that each survivor had to resolve privately. Japanese society offered no framework for processing this experience. The country was focused on rebuilding from devastation, not on interrogating the psychology of failed suicide missions. In 2016, at age 93, Odachi published his memoir, Memoirs of a Kamikaze. The book broke his 7-decade silence about his wartime service. He described the pressure to volunteer, the training, the missions, the returns. He expressed no regret about surviving and no shame about his failure to die. He wanted history to remember that kamikaze pilots were not fanatical zealots, but young men, most of them teenagers, who were exploited by commanders who knew Japan had already lost. He wanted contemporary Japan to understand that the country's current prosperity was built on the graves of a generation sacrificed unnecessarily. And he wanted the world to know that among those ordered to die, some chose life. The historical irony of the kamikaze program lies in its complete strategic failure, disguised as tactical success. Japanese commanders convinced themselves that if they inflicted enough casualties, Americans would agree to negotiated peace rather than invasion. This logic fundamentally misunderstood American resolve. The attack on Pearl Harbor had guaranteed that the United States would accept nothing less than unconditional surrender. Kamikaze attacks did not weaken American determination. They reinforced it by confirming Japanese fanaticism. Every suicide pilot who struck an American ship validated the decision to fight until Japan's complete defeat. The kamikaze succeeded only in providing justification for the very total war they were meant to prevent. For pilots like Odachi, trapped in this doomed strategy, resistance took subtle forms that left ambiguous historical records. He flew missions. He followed orders. He returned alive. Whether his survival represented systematic resistance or accumulated accidents cannot be definitively proven because Odachi himself might not have known. Intention and circumstance blurred at 20,000 feet above the Pacific. What can be stated with certainty is that he was 17 years old, ordered to die, and refused. The refusal may have been active choice or passive exploitation of circumstances, but the outcome remained the same. He lived. The kamikaze who refused his mission haunts history precisely because he cannot be neatly categorized. He was neither martyr nor coward, neither hero nor traitor. He was a 17-year-old boy placed in an impossible situation who found a third option between dying for a lost cause and openly refusing orders that would destroy his family. He existed in the space between the mythology of fanatic volunteers and the reality of coerced teenagers. His story, and the stories of hundreds of pilots who returned from mechanical failure or inability to locate targets, reveals that even in systems designed to make individual choice impossible, humans find ways to assert agency. The technical details of late-war kamikaze operations support this interpretation. By 1945, Japan's aviation infrastructure was collapsing. Aircraft maintenance suffered from part shortages. Mechanics were undertrained because experienced personnel were dead or reassigned. Fuel quality declined as refineries were bombed and supply lines interdicted. Under these conditions, mechanical failures were not merely plausible excuses, but expected outcomes. A pilot who claimed engine trouble returning from a mission was probably telling the truth. Whether he had noticed that engine trouble before takeoff and chose to fly anyway, knowing it would force an abort, is the question that separates passive survival from active resistance. The historical record cannot distinguish between the two, and that ambiguity may have been precisely what allowed pilots like Odachi to survive. The doctrine of special attack tactics extended beyond aircraft. The Imperial Japanese Navy developed the Kaiten, a manned torpedo that was essentially an underwater kamikaze. The Navy also created Shinyo explosive boats, small craft loaded with explosives meant to ram Allied ships. All of these weapons shared the same fundamental characteristic: single-use operators. The pilots, drivers, and torpedo operators were ordnance, human components of weapons designed to be expended. Japan trained hundreds of young men for these programs, often with less preparation than kamikaze pilots received. Many never deployed because the war ended. Those who did deploy faced even lower survival rates than aircraft kamikaze because underwater weapons offered no possibility of aborting a mission. Once launched, a Kaiten pilot could not return. The torpedo had no reverse capability and insufficient fuel to retreat. The choice was impact or drowning. This expansion of suicide tactics into multiple domains reveals how thoroughly Japan's military leadership had embraced human weapons as the solution to material inferiority. When you cannot build better aircraft, turn pilots into guided missiles. When you cannot produce better torpedoes, insert a human guidance system. The logic possessed a ruthless efficiency that ignored the fundamental waste of expending trained personnel as single-use weapons. Every kamikaze pilot represented months of training, language skills, mechanical knowledge, and education that evaporated in seconds upon impact. Japan was consuming its future to sustain a present that could not be sustained. Some kamikaze pilots understood this calculus and rejected it explicitly. Lieutenant Ryoji Uehara wrote before his final mission, "Tomorrow, one who believes in democracy will leave this world. He may look lonely, but his heart is filled with satisfaction. Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany have been defeated. Authoritarianism is like building a house with broken stones." Uehara recognized that he was being sacrificed to preserve an authoritarian system that deserved to fall. He flew anyway, probably from social pressure and family honor, but his final written words condemned the ideology demanding his death. Other pilots left poems and letters expressing love for family, appreciation for beauty, resignation to fate. Very few expressed enthusiasm for dying. The mythology of eager kamikaze embracing death as ultimate honor diverges sharply from the documentary evidence of ambivalence, coercion, and quiet resistance. The American sailors who witnessed kamikaze attacks experienced a different kind of psychological trauma. Unlike conventional air attacks, where both sides understood the goal as survival, suicide attacks removed reciprocity from combat. A kamikaze pilot flying toward a ship could not be deterred by damage. Shooting off a wing would not stop him if the aircraft remained marginally controllable. Only complete destruction before impact provided safety. This created a unique form of combat stress because the enemy was already dead from his own perspective. You were not fighting a pilot trying to kill you and escape. You were fighting a guided weapon wearing human skin. The dehumanization ran both directions. American sailors stopped seeing kamikaze as enemy pilots and began treating them as bombs that happened to be piloted. The recovery of bodies after attacks sometimes led to brutal treatment as crews vented rage at corpses. Yet there were exceptions. When a kamikaze struck USS Missouri during the Battle of Okinawa, the ship's captain ordered a full military burial at sea for the pilot's remains, recognizing him as a warrior who had died following orders. The end of the war left surviving kamikaze pilots in an ambiguous social position. They had volunteered for suicide missions and failed. Some survivors, particularly those who returned once or twice before the surrender, felt guilty about living when squadron mates had died. Others, particularly those like Odachi who returned repeatedly, faced whispered accusations of cowardice that persisted for decades. Japanese post-war society had no framework for honoring failed suicide bombers. They were not heroes because they had not died. They were not victims because they had volunteered. They occupied a liminal space that made discussing their experiences socially awkward at best and professionally damaging at worst. Many simply chose silence. The cultural legacy of kamikaze in Japan remains contested. Conservative political factions leonize them as examples of traditional virtues like loyalty, self-sacrifice, and dedication to nation. Progressive factions view them as victims of militaristic manipulation, young men whose deaths achieved nothing but validating the necessity of Japan's post-war pacifist constitution. Both interpretations simplify a complex phenomenon where individual experiences varied enormously. Some pilots were fanatics who genuinely believed dying would save Japan. Some were victims of coercion so intense that refusal was psychologically impossible. And some were resistors who found ways to survive by exploiting the gap between orders and verification. All three categories existed simultaneously, and individual pilots might have moved between them across multiple missions. The story of kamikaze pilots who refuse their missions or who return from them repeatedly matters because it demonstrates that even in totalitarian systems designed to eliminate individual choice, humans retain agency. The agency may be limited, expressed through small acts of resistance or exploitation of systemic ambiguities, but it exists. Odachi could not refuse to fly without destroying his family. He could not openly disobey without facing execution. But he could jettison his bomb when fighters appeared. He could claim mechanical failure. He could report inability to find targets in cloudy conditions. Across 8 missions, he found 8 reasons not to complete the final dive. Whether he manufactured these reasons or genuinely encountered obstacles matters less than the pattern of survival they created. This pattern suggests that more kamikaze pilots may have engaged in similar quiet resistance than official records acknowledge. The approximately 25 to 33% of missions that failed to reach targets likely included some pilots who deliberately avoided success. The historical invisibility of this resistance reflects both Japanese cultural reluctance to label kamikaze as anything other than martyrs or victims, and the simple fact that pilots who survived could not openly admit they had chosen life over duty without invalidating the sacrifices of those who died. The conspiracy of silence protected both survivors and the mythology surrounding kamikaze. Modern analysis of kamikaze effectiveness reveals how thoroughly Japanese commanders miscalculated. In terms of ships sunk per pilot killed, suicide attacks achieved marginally better results than conventional bombing. But conventional bombing allowed pilots to fly multiple missions, gaining experience and improving accuracy. Kamikaze doctrine guaranteed that every pilot flew only one successful mission, making accumulated experience impossible. This meant that late-war kamikaze pilots were no more effective than early-war pilots because nobody survived to pass on tactical knowledge. The program was a short-term tactical expedient dressed in the language of ancient warrior tradition, implemented by commanders who knew it would fail but needed to demonstrate they were doing anything to slow the American advance. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and subsequent Soviet declaration of war rendered all kamikaze preparations for the invasion of the home islands moot. Japan had stockpiled thousands of aircraft, trained thousands of pilots, and positioned them across Kyushu and Honshu Islands in preparation for Operation Ketsugo, the final defense. These pilots were meant to swarm American invasion fleets in attacks that would dwarf Okinawa. Some estimates suggested Japan planned to expend 10,000 aircraft in suicide attacks during the first days of an invasion. Whether this would have actually happened, or whether mass desertions would have occurred as pilots faced the reality of dying for a manifestly lost cause, remains speculative. The atomic bombs terminated the question by making invasion unnecessary. Odachi lived until 2024, dying at age 97, having spent most of his adult life in silence about his wartime service. His memoir, published when he was 93, broke that silence partially out of duty to history and partially because the generation that had judged kamikaze survivors was largely dead. He spent his final years giving interviews, speaking to historians, trying to ensure that young people understood kamikaze pilots as teenagers exploited by commanders, not as fanatical volunteers. He wanted his survival acknowledged, not as cowardice, but as the outcome of circumstances he had navigated as a 17-year-old kid trying not to die stupidly. He expressed no regret about living and no shame about returning for missions. He reserved his anger for the commanders who had ordered teenagers to die and then lived comfortably into old age. The historical question of whether Odachi refused his missions or simply encountered repeated obstacles that forced legitimate aborts will never be conclusively answered. Perhaps he himself did not know. Perhaps at 17, facing death orders, the line between deliberate evasion and taking advantage of circumstances dissolved. Perhaps he flew out hoping to find targets and felt relieved when he didn't, then flew out again hoping and relieved again, 8 times until the war ended. The ambiguity at the core of his story reflects the ambiguity in all human experience of coercion and choice. We are rarely faced with pure free will or total compulsion. Most choices exist in the gray space where pressure, circumstance, rationalization, and decision blend together. What remains clear is that Odachi represents a category of kamikaze experience rarely acknowledged in historical accounts. He was neither the eager volunteer of Japanese wartime propaganda nor the completely coerced victim of post-war progressive narratives. He was somewhere in between, navigating impossible circumstances with whatever tools and choices remained available to a teenager in a collapsing empire. His story haunts history because it cannot be simplified into comfortable moral categories. It forces acknowledgement that even in systems designed to make individual choice impossible, spaces for resistance persist, even if that resistance consists only of returning repeatedly for missions that might have killed you. The kamikaze who refused his mission, or who returned from it 8 times claiming failure, exposes the gap between totalitarian intentions and human reality. Japan's military leadership believed they could transform entire generations of young men into obedient weapons. They were partially successful. Thousands of pilots did complete suicide missions, either from genuine belief, coerced compliance, or the psychological impossibility of backing out after public commitment. But hundreds of others found ways to survive by exploiting mechanical failures, weather conditions, and the verification difficulties of chaotic late-war operations. These survivors lived with ambiguous legacies, unable to claim heroism or victimhood, simply carrying the knowledge that they had been ordered to die and had refused. Their refusal haunts history because it suggests that totalitarian control, no matter how thorough, cannot entirely eliminate human agency. The pilots who returned were neither heroes nor cowards. They were humans who found a third option in a system that claimed only 2 existed. That they managed to survive at all in a culture and military structure designed to make survival impossible represents a form of resistance worthy of acknowledgement. Their stories complicate the mythology surrounding kamikaze pilots, replacing simple narratives of fanaticism or victimhood with the messier reality of young men making impossible choices under conditions that should have killed them. Some chose to die, some were forced to die, and some, like Kazuo Odachi, chose to live despite everything designed to prevent that choice. History must acknowledge all 3 categories. If this story gave you a new way to see the Pacific War, like, share, and subscribe, and tell us which moment surprised you most. We'll return next week with another chapter in the war that changed the world. Expansion sections for Kamikaze script. The material specifications of the A6M Zero reveal why it became the primary kamikaze platform despite its obsolescence by 1945. The aircraft weighed 1,680 kilograms empty and 2,410 kilograms fully loaded with pilot, fuel, and ammunition in its original fighter configuration. Its Nakajima NK-1C Sakae 12 14-cylinder radial engine generated 940 horsepower at takeoff, upgraded to 1,130 horsepower in later models. Maximum speed reached 533 kilometers per hour at 4,550 meters altitude. Range extended to 3,000 kilometers with external drop tanks, a capability that had enabled the Zero to escort bombers on the Pearl Harbor raid across vast Pacific distances. But by 1945, these specifications represented outdated technology against American fighters like the F-6F Hellcat, which achieved 629 kilometers per hour, carried 6.50 caliber machine guns compared to the Zero's 2 7.7 millimeters guns and 2 20 millimeters cannons, and featured armor plating that could absorb punishment that would shred a Zero. The Zero's greatest weakness, and the characteristic that made it simultaneously perfect and terrible for kamikaze missions, was its lack of self-sealing fuel tanks and armor protection. Designer Jiro Horikoshi had prioritized range and maneuverability over pilot survival, a choice that made sense in 1940 when Japanese naval doctrine emphasized offensive operations and pilots expected to dominate enemy aircraft through superior skill and agility. But this philosophy became suicidal once American pilots learned to avoid turning dogfights and instead use superior speed and diving ability to conduct hit-and-run attacks. A single burst of .50 caliber fire could ignite a Zero's fuel tanks, transforming the aircraft into a fireball. For conventional combat, this vulnerability was catastrophic. For kamikaze operations, it became irrelevant. If the pilot intended to crash anyway, armor and self-sealing tanks served no purpose except adding weight. The Zero's vulnerability became an asset when death was the mission objective. Modifications for kamikaze duty were extensive but straightforward. Armaments were often reduced or removed entirely to save weight for larger bombs. The standard nose-mounted 7.7mm Type 97 machine guns were deleted, along with one or both of the wing-mounted 20mm Type 99 cannons. Armor plating behind the pilot's seat, minimal to begin with, was sometimes removed. Radio equipment was simplified or eliminated on the logic that pilots flying one-way missions needed only basic communication capability. The external fuel drop tank mounting point on the centerline was converted to a bomb hardpoint capable of carrying ordnance ranging from 250 kilograms to occasionally 500 kilograms. Some Kamikaze Zeros retained underwing racks for smaller 60-kilogram bombs, though most relied on a single large centerline weapon. The attachment required reinforced mounting brackets and an arming mechanism that prevented premature detonation while allowing the bomb to explode on impact. Fuel calculations for kamikaze missions involve precise but grim mathematics. Internal fuel capacity of 570 liters provided approximately 4 hours of flight at economical cruise settings of 60% power, consuming roughly 140 liters per hour. Maximum speed operations increase consumption to 250 liters per hour, cutting endurance to barely 2 hours. Mission profiles typically assumed 3 hours total. 1 hour transit to target area at cruise power, consuming 140 liters. 1 hour searching for targets at mixed power settings, consuming 160 liters. Final attack run and impact, consuming remaining 270 liters. This calculation left a theoretical reserve for return to base if no targets could be located, but barely. A pilot who spent extra time searching or encountered headwinds on the return leg would exhaust fuel before reaching Taiwan or the Philippines. The fuel load itself became a coercive mechanism, allowing returns only under specific circumstances while making extended hesitation fatal. The psychology of the pre-mission ritual deserves examination for its calculated cruelty disguised as honor. Pilots selected for the next day's mission would be informed the previous evening, giving them the night to prepare. They were encouraged to write final letters to family, though these letters passed through military censors who removed any content deemed defeatist or critical of the war. Pilots drafted wills disposing of personal property, typically small items like watches or photographs. They exchange belongings with squadron mates as keepsakes. The morning of the mission, pilots participated in a ceremony involving ritualized elements drawn from Shinto and Buddhist practices mixed with military protocol. Officers read the emperor's rescript to soldiers and sailors, emphasizing duty unto death. Pilots drank sake ceremonially, often with commanders who would return safely to base after watching their charges fly to destruction. They donned white scarves and headbands marked with the rising sun emblem. They recited death poems or listened to poems composed by famous kamikaze before them. This ritual served multiple functions beyond simple preparation for death. It created public commitment that made backing out socially impossible. To participate in the ceremony and then refuse to fly would humiliate not only the pilot, but everyone who had invested the ritual with meaning. It transformed private reluctance into public shame. The ritual also created psychological momentum that carried reluctant pilots through the actual takeoff. Having written farewell letters, having given away possessions, having told family and friends goodbye through official channels, the pilot had already socially died. Continuing to live would require explaining to everyone why the letters they received were premature, why the death that had been announced and mourned had not actually occurred. The social pressure to fulfill the announced death often exceeded the pressure of direct military orders. American pilots who intercepted kamikaze formations reported behaviors that suggested varying degrees of commitment among the suicide pilots. Some kamikaze flew directly toward their targets through withering anti-aircraft fire, maintaining course even as their aircraft disintegrated around them. These pilots were either genuinely committed or so terrified that they froze in forward flight. Others exhibited evasive maneuvers inconsistent with suicide attack doctrine. They would dodge anti-aircraft tracers or attempt to evade pursuing fighters rather than maintaining course. Some kamikaze appeared to deliberately fly into the ocean, short of their targets when damaged, suggesting that pilots chose quick death by impact over burning or drowning. And some kamikaze turned away from a fleet when engaged, disappearing into clouds or flying toward the horizon. American pilots initially interpreted these turns as tactical retreats to set up better attack angles. Later analysis suggested that some percentage of kamikaze used combat engagement as cover to abort missions without directly refusing orders. The verification problem plagued the kamikaze command structure. In conventional air combat, pilots returned and provided debriefing reports about enemy destroyed, damage inflicted, and tactics observed. Squadron leaders could assess performance and provide training to correct deficiencies. But kamikaze missions, by design, generated no returning pilots to debrief. Success could only be inferred from reports by escort aircraft or observation posts, both of which operated in chaotic combat conditions where accurate assessment was nearly impossible. A pilot who radioed Hisatsu before impact might have struck a destroyer or might have missed entirely and crashed in the ocean beyond view. Escort pilots observing from altitude through smoke and anti-aircraft fire could mistake near misses for direct hits or fail to see successful strikes amid the confusion. Some kamikaze who returned claiming inability to find targets might have been telling truth, or they might have avoided the fleet area entirely. The command structure lacked mechanisms to distinguish truth from evasion. This verification gap created opportunities for pilots seeking to survive. If a pilot jettisoned his bomb over open ocean and claimed he had struck an enemy ship before being hit by anti-aircraft fire, who could contradict him? American ships did not report being struck by aircraft that subsequently exploded harmlessly in the water. Japanese observers watching from escort aircraft at high altitude through smoke and distance could not verify the claim. The pilot could conceivably execute this deception once and be killed on the second mission, or he might execute it repeatedly if operational chaos and command desperation allowed. How many kamikaze pilots engaged in this form of resistance cannot be determined because successful deception left no records and unsuccessful attempts likely resulted in execution or reassignment without documentation. The fate of pilots who openly refused kamikaze duty varied with circumstances and commanders. Official policy permitted returns for legitimate mechanical or weather reasons, but defining legitimate remained subjective. Some commanders accepted any excuse to preserve scarce pilots and aircraft. Others demanded evidence of damage or interrogated returning pilots aggressively. A few commanders reportedly executed pilots as examples, though documentation remains fragmentary. The most commonly cited case, the pilot supposedly shot after his ninth return, appears in multiple sources but without names, dates, or specific units. This suggests either that the incident occurred but details were deliberately suppressed, or that it circulated as apocryphal warning intended to deter other pilots from excessive returns. The effect was the same. Pilots believed execution was possible if they returned too many times without dying. That belief, whether based on reality or rumor, influenced behavior as effectively as actual executions would have. Mechanical failure provided the most defensible excuse for returning without completing a mission. The A6M Zero, even when properly maintained, experienced mechanical problems with concerning frequency. Engine failures occurred due to worn components, inadequate oil, contaminated fuel, or simple manufacturing defects. Radios malfunctioned regularly. Control surfaces jammed. Hydraulic systems leaked. These were genuine problems that grounded aircraft even under peacetime conditions. By late 1944 and through 1945, Japan's aviation infrastructure was collapsing under sustained American bombardment and resource shortages. Spare parts became scarce. Lubricants were diluted with substitutes that degraded performance. Fuel quality declined as refineries were destroyed and reserves depleted. Mechanics worked with inadequate tools and insufficient rest. Under these conditions, mechanical failure was not merely a plausible excuse, but an expected outcome. Perhaps 30% of aircraft suffered mechanical problems severe enough to warrant mission abort. A pilot claiming engine trouble was probably telling truth. But the line between mechanical failure and mechanical sabotage remained deliberately blurred. A pilot who wanted to survive could conduct pre-flight inspection carelessly, missing problems that would manifest after takeoff. He could operate the engine roughly during warm-up, accelerating where that would cause failure mid-mission. He could report intermittent problems that ground crews could not reproduce during testing. Small acts of negligence or minor sabotage that created mechanical excuses for aborting missions were nearly impossible to distinguish from genuine bad luck. The chaos of late-war operations meant that aircraft received abbreviated inspections, maintenance was deferred, and pilots flew machines that would have been grounded in earlier years. This environment provided cover for pilots seeking survival through malicious compliance, following orders to fly while arranging circumstances that prevented mission completion. Weather provided another category of legitimate excuse, though evaluating weather claims proved even more difficult than assessing mechanical failures. Pacific weather changed rapidly and unpredictably. Typhoons could develop within hours. Cloud formations that appeared manageable at dawn could become impenetrable by midday. Visibility that seemed adequate at altitude deteriorated near the ocean surface, where Kamikaze made their final approaches. A pilot who reported being unable to locate the fleet due to clouds might be accurately describing conditions, or he might have deliberately flown into cloud banks to create the excuse. Reconnaissance aircraft sometimes preceded kamikaze missions to verify fleet locations and weather, but reconnaissance reports became outdated within hours as ships moved and conditions changed. A pilot could claim that targets were not where reconnaissance had reported them, and verification was impossible unless other pilots from the same mission successfully struck ships in that area. The role of escort pilots in the kamikaze system deserves attention for its particular cruelty. These were experienced aviators, often veterans of early war campaigns, who had survived through skill, luck, and accumulated tactical knowledge. They were assigned to escort kamikaze formations not to attack alongside them, but to shepherd inexperienced pilots through the journey to the target area, to help them navigate, to provide some defense against intercepting American fighters, and to observe results for intelligence purposes. Escort pilots were explicitly ordered to return to base after kamikaze made their attacks. This created a psychologically devastating inversion of normal military hierarchy, where experienced leaders went first into danger, while novices followed. Here, experienced pilots watched teenagers and 20-year-olds fly to certain death while preserving their own lives by following orders. Several escort pilots later reported that this duty was more traumatic than any combat they had experienced, because they were actively facilitating mass suicide while remaining spectators to slaughter. Some escort pilots attempted to subvert their role by providing inadequate navigation assistance or by engaging American interceptors so aggressively that kamikaze could escape in the confusion. These acts of subtle resistance were difficult to prove, and possibly unconscious expressions of guilt rather than deliberate sabotage. An escort pilot who lost his kamikaze formation in clouds could claim navigation error while secretly feeling relieved. An escort who engaged American fighters with such intensity that he drew them away from the kamikaze could claim zealous execution of defensive duties while knowing he was providing kamikaze with escape opportunities. The psychological complexity of the escort role generated behaviors that commanders could interpret as either dedication or subtle betrayal depending on outcomes and suspicions. The letters and poems left by kamikaze pilots provide the most direct evidence of their actual thoughts and feelings, though even these sources must be interpreted carefully because they passed through military censors. Censors removed content deemed defeatist, critical of military leadership, or insufficiently patriotic. What remains in surviving letters likely represents a filtered version of pilots' final thoughts, edited to conform to acceptable themes. Yet, even within these constraints, patterns emerge. Very few letters express enthusiasm about dying. Most express resignation, sadness, and love for family. Many apologize to parents for failing to care for them in old age, a critical duty in Confucian-influenced Japanese culture. Some express hope that their deaths will contribute to Japan's survival. Very few claim certainty that death will achieve anything. The overwhelming emotion conveyed through surviving letters is sadness mixed with determination to fulfill duty, even while recognizing its futility. Lieutenant Yukio Seiki, who commanded the first official kamikaze mission on October 25, 1944, exemplified this resigned determination. Seiki was not a volunteer, but an experienced pilot ordered to lead inexperienced volunteers. He told friends before the mission, "Japan's future is bleak if it is forced to kill one of its best pilots. I am not going on this mission for the Emperor or for the Empire. I am going because I was ordered to." Seiki's words, recorded by friends who survived the war, reveal that even the first kamikaze understood the strategic bankruptcy of the tactic. He flew anyway, probably because refusing would have dishonored his family and accomplished nothing except his own death by execution rather than in combat. His plane struck USS St. Lo and sank it, making Seiki the most successful kamikaze pilot by the crude metric of largest ship destroyed. His success validated the tactic and encouraged expansion of the program that would kill thousands more pilots to achieve minimal strategic impact. The American strategic response to kamikaze attacks involved multiple layers of defense, each with varying effectiveness. The outermost layer consisted of combat air patrols stationed over known Japanese airfields to intercept kamikaze at takeoff. This proved partially effective, but required enormous commitments of aircraft and pilots to maintain continuous coverage over multiple airfields across hundreds of miles. The second layer involved picket destroyers stationed 60 miles from the main fleet, equipped with radar to provide early warning. These destroyers bore disproportionate casualties because kamikaze often attacked the first ship they encountered rather than pressing on to find carriers. Multiple picket destroyers were sunk and many more damaged, effectively trading destroyer casualties for carrier protection. The third layer involved fighter patrols around the fleet itself, positioned to intercept kamikaze that penetrated the outer defenses. The final layer consisted of anti-aircraft fire from every ship in the fleet, creating walls of tracers and explosions that kamikaze had to fly through to reach targets. This layered defense achieved approximately 87% effectiveness, meaning that only 13% of kamikaze that reached visual range of the fleet successfully struck ships. But 13% of hundreds of aircraft still translated to dozens of hits. At the Battle of Okinawa, which involved the most intensive kamikaze campaign of the war, approximately 1,900 kamikaze sorties were launched. Of these, roughly 250 struck American ships. The attacks sank 26 vessels and damaged 164 others, killing nearly 5,000 American sailors. These casualties exceeded American losses in any other single naval campaign of the Pacific War. Yet strategically, the damage barely slowed American operations. Sunk ships were mostly destroyers and support vessels, not fleet carriers or battleships. Damaged ships were repaired or replaced from America's vast production capacity. The kamikaze campaign at Okinawa inflicted painful losses, but failed to prevent American victory or delay the invasion timetable. The post-war occupation of Japan by American forces created complicated dynamics around kamikaze memory. American occupation authorities initially suppressed discussion of kamikaze as glorification of militarism, which was banned under occupation policy. Japanese conservatives who sought to preserve traditional military honor found themselves unable to openly celebrate kamikaze pilots without risking censure from occupation officials. Meanwhile, Japanese progressives who viewed kamikaze as victims of militaristic manipulation also faced constraints because criticizing the emperor system, too, directly could provoke nationalist backlash. This created a cultural silence around kamikaze memory that lasted into the 1950s and beyond. Surviving kamikaze pilots found themselves unable to discuss their experiences because no acceptable framework existed for processing them. They were neither celebrated as heroes nor openly acknowledged as victims. They simply existed in silent ambiguity. This silence gradually eroded as Japan regained sovereignty and began developing its own historical narratives about the war. By the 1970s and 1980s, surviving kamikaze pilots began speaking publicly, though often in carefully framed contexts. Some presented themselves as reluctant participants who had no choice. Others emphasized their sincere belief at the time that dying would protect Japan, while acknowledging in hindsight that they had been misled. Very few expressed regret about surviving. The guilt they carried was not about failing to die, but about living while friends died. This survivor's guilt affected not only kamikaze who returned for missions, but also pilots who were trained for kamikaze duty but never flew because the war ended. These men spent decades wondering whether they would have completed the mission if called, unable to prove their courage because circumstances never required them to die. The technological evolution of kamikaze weapons during the war revealed increasing desperation. The original concept involved standard fighter aircraft loaded with bombs, utilizing existing equipment and pilots trained for conventional combat. But as losses mounted and conventional aircraft became scarce, Japan developed purpose-built suicide weapons. The Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka, called Baka Idiot by Americans, was essentially a piloted cruise missile. The aircraft was built of wood and metal with rocket propulsion, carried a 1,200-kilogram warhead, and was launched from a mother plane at altitude. Once released, the Oka pilot would glide toward the target before igniting rockets for a terminal dive at over 600 kilometers per hour. The speed made interception nearly impossible, but launching the Oka required getting the slow, heavy mother plane within 20 kilometers of American ships, and American fighters targeted mother planes before they could launch. Few Oka successfully struck targets, and the program consumed both the suicide pilots and the twin-engine bombers carrying them, accelerating Japan's aviation crisis. Other desperate innovations included the Nakajima Ki 115 Tsurugi, a fighter designed specifically for kamikaze missions with minimal construction time and cost. The aircraft was built of wood, carried a single bomb, and had jettisonable landing gear that could be reused after takeoff, reducing production costs. The landing gear feature revealed the depth of Japan's desperation. They were designing aircraft that could never land, building disposability into the airframe itself. Fortunately for the pilots assigned to fly them, production delays meant that fewer than 105 Tsurugi were completed before the war ended, and none saw combat. But the existence of this program demonstrated that Japan's military leadership had committed to suicide tactics as a permanent strategy rather than temporary expedient. They were building infrastructure for systematic self-destruction. The moment of Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast on August 15, 1945, created chaos across Japanese military units as commanders grappled with accepting defeat. Some kamikaze pilots who had been preparing for missions that day refused to accept the surrender and attempted to take off anyway, only to be physically restrained by ground crews. Others expressed relief so intense that they collapsed in tears. Admiral Matome Ogaki, who had been Vice Admiral Onishi's replacement as commander of kamikaze forces, refused to accept the surrender and flew a final unauthorized kamikaze mission on August 15th, crashing his aircraft into the ocean without hitting any targets. His death accomplished nothing except adding his name to the list of pointless kamikaze casualties. He remains controversial in Japan as either a final example of commitment to duty or a final example of the fanaticism that had made the kamikaze possible. For pilots like Odachi, the surrender brought immediate relief, mixed with profound disorientation. Everything he had been trained for, the death he had been told was his destiny and purpose, suddenly became unnecessary. The empire that had demanded his life no longer existed. The honor structure that made death glorious collapsed overnight. He was 17 years old, alive when he should have been dead, returning to a defeated nation that had no use for living kamikaze pilots. The skills he had developed had no peacetime application. flying attack aircraft, navigating to targets, jettisoning bombs, returning from missions. None of this translated to civilian work. He had been trained for death, and now he had to learn to live.